Good evening, everybody. You're all very welcome to our February Kilrush District Historical Society monthly lecture. Welcome to those who are here in the room with us, a huge crowd tonight. Welcome to 22 or something people are hopefully watching us on YouTube. It says there's 22 waiting. And I need to hit a play button. Hopefully you can hear us by now, even though now I see 24 people watching. So we're all here, we're all live on YouTube. We're delighted to welcome Catherine Porter, who's going to talk to us about County Clare and the first Ordnance Survey of Ireland. Catherine is originally from County Down. She's Associate Professor and Head of Geography in the School of History and Geography at the University of Limerick, and has been heavily involved as the lead investigator in the OS 200 Digitally Remapping Ireland's Ordnance Survey Heritage Digital Humanities Project, co-founded by Taija Aaron and the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Anyway, that's a lot of verbiage, but Catherine is going to make it all very simple for us this evening. So please give her a big welcome. And I already see we can be heard on YouTube. Let us know on YouTube if there's any problems with the sound.
Lovely. Okay, thank you so much, Paddy, for that warm welcome. And it's wonderful to see so many people here this evening as well. I would just clarify a little what Paddy has said there. Yes, I'm the lead investigator for the Irish cohort of the project. There's also another lead investigator for the UK as well, and a lot of other people involved in the things that I'm going to show you today. So this is certainly not just my work, it's the work of a big team of people. Will I move that back a little tiny bit? So today I'm going to provide a brief context to the survey, first of all. Now, I know that a lot of you are very aware of the Ordnance Survey in Ireland and the work that they did, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the background there so that we have some context to the things that I mentioned later. I'm also going to speak a little bit about the current project, OS 200, which Paddy mentioned. And of course, the survey was much more than just maps. So I want to show you some examples of the other source materials that came about during the survey or came out of the survey as well. And in particular, how these connect with the geographies of the island as well. And within this, I'll include some examples from our project, some of the things that we have been doing with sort of modern digital and cartographic techniques to try and expose maybe things that have been hidden before in the source material. So just to show you the power of those sorts of digital technologies. And then I'm going to introduce you to a new online resource which has come out of the project that is something that is available for all of you to use in your own time after this evening. So I want to begin then a little bit with some background on the survey, some context. And we're going back to the early 19th century, of course. We are 21 years before the Great Famine. And at this point in time, we have Westminster looking towards a revaluation of the land in Ireland. Now, this revaluation was largely required, of course, because of taxation, so the county cess. And at the time, the county cess was based on earlier 17th century surveys. So ones that we would be familiar with, such as the Down survey, of course, also the Stratford survey as well. And there were several reasons for this. One of them was that landlords actually felt that they had made improvements to the land and that wasn't reflected in the taxation. Also, in addition, aside from, of course, the inaccuracies that were in some of those early surveys in terms of acreage, for instance, there'd been no revisions since that time. So land divisions had changed, in other words, in that interim period, and that taxation no longer reflected the land's true value. So to achieve then this cess reform would not be straightforward, and it would require a much more detailed and scientific survey than ever before to incorporate what was that smallest administrative boundary on the island, the townland as we know it today. And Thomas Spring Rice, the then MP for Limerick City, he chaired the committee in his own name to explore a new and detailed land survey of Ireland. And in reading the committee's reports today, we can learn quite a lot about the people who were attending and giving testimony in that particular committee as well. But overall, really, we learned that surveying skills in Ireland at this time were deemed insufficient to actually carry out such a detailed survey. This is debatable, of course, bearing in mind it was only a small number of men who were under discussion in this. And they gathered and they critiqued existing cartography. They looked at survey methodologies, available surveyors and their skill sets. So they looked at lots of different aspects of what had come before, what was available at that time as well. And it was on the 22nd of March in 1824, almost 201 years ago, that a man named Thomas Colby first gave evidence to the committee. He had at this time been employed for 23 years in the trigonometrical survey of Great Britain. And he projected that actually this survey mission for Ireland would take 6 to 7 years. Of course, we know now that it took an awful lot longer than that. He also recommended that it be mapped at the scale of 6 inches to the mile. And if that was to be achieved, which of course we know now that it was, it would be the first country in the whole world, first whole country in the whole world to be mapped at that scale. Now, the report from the Select Committee was published on the 21st of June in 1824, with much persuasion, I should say, from Spring Rice, the Master General of Ordnance, who was the Duke of Wellington at the time. He approved the recommendations of the committee to survey the island at townland level. And it was Major General Thomas Colby who had given the knowledge and the skills that he had developed during his time surveying Great Britain. He was therefore put in charge in 1824 out of the findings of that committee. And so then the British Ordnance was tasked with the venture. And they had some money to start off with in the form of this primary triangulation. So this was the first task. It was equivalent to really less than $500,000 in today's money. Now more money came as the survey progressed. And Colby and 2 other men, a man named Portlock and another named Drummond, were also brought on board to assist in the task. Later, of course, we had Lieutenant Larkham arrive. He from 1828 led the day-to-day survey operations. And Richard Griffith, who was a civilian and engineer, who later, of course, led Griffith's valuation, but also as part of this core survey, led what was called the boundary team as well, which I'll talk a little bit more about shortly. So the first task then in creating the maps was measurement. So they had to create a primary triangulation network. So here we're thinking back to our school days of trigonometry. They had to take sightings, measure angles and distances between far-off mountain tops. So in essence, they were creating a network of invisible triangles covering the entire island of Ireland. And one side of the triangle, of course, needed to be very accurately measured in length. First of all, I'll talk about that in more detail shortly. And based on that one length, then every other triangle side could be calculated relating to that particular baseline measurement. Now, setting up at one triangulation pillar, then you could also measure the angle between 2 other points, of course. And these measurements then allowed them to determine the distances that you couldn't measure accurately via traditional ground methods. They also used these same points to connect with Great Britain as well. So points in England, Scotland and Wales. And you can see some of those on the map that's shown here on the screen. So they're stretching across to Merrick, to Scafell and to Snowdon as well. Now, some of the sides of these triangles were up to 150 kilometres in length. So straight away they had a major conundrum. How were they actually going to view these distances and take these measurements? And this is Ramsden's 3-foot theodolite. It weighs approximately 90 kilos, so about 14 stone. And this equipment had to be carried up these hills by labourers and by members of the Ordnance Survey staff. And it was to measure angles, to take angular measurement, but of course visibility was also going to be an issue. Traditionally, surveyors, of course, lit fires so they could see things in far off places. This wasn't, of course, plausible with the Irish climate, also because they were going to be working all year round as well. And the technology that they had at the time, most up to date would have been something like the argon lamp, for instance. That just wouldn't cut it. That wasn't going to work for these sorts of extreme distances. And so the OS instead, specifically Lieutenant Drummond, who I mentioned previously, developed what is known as the Drummond lamp, or what we would know today as the limelight. It is an oxygen alcohol limelight, so very, very bright, as you can see here from the quote, to penetrate Ireland's inveterate haze and fogginess. And this meant that they could view these survey points at far off distances. So we had the primary triangulation network. We had all of those sites selected across the island. We knew that all points would be observable. But within this, then, they had to have that precise measurement of that one side of one triangle. And this was carried out in Lough Foyle. I'm sure many of you have heard of the Lough Foyle baseline before. They needed a long, flat landscape for this. And this being up in the north coast, it runs from Ballykelly to McGilligan Point, right up in the north coast. Now, of course, there are lots of other flat landscapes across Ireland that they could have picked as well, but I believe this was preferable because it was going to be slightly closer to GB, so they could start to actually do those measurements across the Irish Sea at that point as well. So they started to measure at Ballykelly the full length of this baseline using a tent for shelter from the weather, and of course the fluctuating temperatures as well. So they would shift it foot by foot, moving the tent all along the 8 miles of that baseline. And to do this, they needed some sort of specialised equipment again. Chains, for instance, are very prone to changes in length due to temperature, due to use as well. And you can just about see the equipment here in the images on screen inside that tent, that illustration at the top of the screen. And this was actually a specialised piece of equipment now known as Colby's compensation bars. It was devised by Colby, constructed again by Drummond. He was definitely, I think it's fair to say, the brains behind a lot of the engineering that went on here. And really it works by applying the compensation principle that would be used when manufacturing balances and pendulums. So we have 2 different rates of expansion from 2 different types of metals, basically they would cancel each other out over the total length of the apparatus, so it would remain unchanged. And actually in the 1960s, the baseline was remeasured using much more modern equipment, and they found that it was less than an inch out over the 8 miles. So they'd done an extraordinary job really for those times. In the landscape then and in the maps, and this is something that me as a historical geographer is particularly interested in, we can see relics of this survey as well. These are just some images that are taken from the first edition maps, but also from satellite imagery of these places as well. The very last point in this baseline at McGilligan has now actually been lost to the sea due to erosion, but it's really interesting the way the maps themselves can sort of hold and display a lot of the survey's history in this sort of tangible form as well. So once they had that primary network in place, they could move on to the secondary and tertiary networks that came next. So in other words, smaller triangles within that primary network. So first we had the primary trig with that great theodolite, Ramsden's theodolite that I showed you. Then they moved down into the secondary smaller theodolites were used, 12-inch theodolites, so maybe 2 to 4 points per parish, because we're at sort of parish scale by that point. And then further again subdivided into triangles at townland level. So 7 to 8 inch theodolites, 1 to 2 points per townland as they moved across the landscape. And this is also where some of the more traditional forms of survey came in as well. So we would have had chain and pole measurement, for instance, as well. And you can even see here on screen, I've just marked these out on one of the maps. These would have been very typical of the chain lines that were running down a hill as they were measuring from point to point. And just to give you a bit of a feel here for how complex this was as well, this is an image of a full triangulation network for a whole map sheet. It's taken from a slightly later Ordnance Survey, and it was a photograph that I took at the Tulcherin, or the Ordnance Survey Ireland headquarters in Phoenix Park last summer. But you can really see the complexity, I think, coming through in that, and the number of measurements that were required to actually construct these sorts of maps. At the same time then, indeed actually ahead of the surveyors themselves who were doing the measuring, was Richard Griffith's boundary team. And they were tasked with finding the limits of each of the parishes and the townlands across the island. Typically, they would have begun with a list of townlands, maybe coming from a barony authority of some kind. They would have names, they would maybe be able to check the extent of the boundaries with local landowners. Sometimes they had estate maps, of course, to work with as well. They heavily relied on local informants too. They were called mearsmen, so a mearing being a boundary between places, so maybe between a townland or a parish or something like that. So these boundaries were marked out by that boundary team. And then the idea was that later the surveyors would follow and they would come to measure. So they would see these points left by the boundary team in terms of the marks in the landscape. And then the surveyor's notes would then later be sent to Dublin and translated to the maps that we're familiar with. Now, as I said, they relied very heavily on locals as informants as to where the boundaries were, but just like today, perhaps we could say they didn't always agree. Sometimes these people were, I might say in inverted commas, trusted sources, so people such as clergy, again, landowners, people who may have had some self-interest, of course, as well. But as I say, they really very much relied on the local people, the people who worked the landscape, the people who knew the landscape themselves. So I'm sure many of you know exactly where your townland boundary begins and ends, etc. So they were relying on people like us, you know, to inform them and to help them out with that. What this meant, though, and I think this is something that isn't always made clear in some of the literature as well, is that they were defining and they were recording the known boundaries, but they were also creating them, and in detail like never before. So in some places, they were actually created from new, others were removed or maybe amalgamated, and in some parts they were divided as well, and that meant that often we see additional naming added to the townlands. So that would be typically where you would see east-west or upper-lower appear. So previously you wouldn't have seen that same split. And I think we're all familiar with places like that, or maybe even live in one. But to give you an idea of what happened there in terms of the sort of progression with the townlands, if I can call it that, in Inishowen, the projection was that there were 180 townlands, but actually the Ordnance Survey have 340 townlands. So it gives you a bit of a feel for the sorts of changes that were happening there to the landscape. And again, you know, reflecting on it in the modern context, these are the places that we know today, but probably quite different to what our ancestors knew. The revisions were made, of course, in the 1850s, based on changing boundaries. As we know, they do change over time, also due to physical erosion as well, but landowning changes as well. And of course, we now have over 60,000 townlands across the island. I think, again, it's about reflecting today, thinking about your own townland today, the boundaries of that. They rest on the outcome of this survey. Given, though, the slower speed of the survey work that was coming up behind Griffith and his boundary team, Griffith definitely was concerned that some of his markers might be lost or something else might happen to them before the surveyors would even reach that point. And in staff correspondence in relation to the survey, we see this mentioned quite a few times, actually. And this is an example letter written from Ballinderry, from James Brady to Lieutenant Bailey. And he's informing the lieutenant here that he's cautioned his parishioners against removing or changing the situation of the poles that have been put up by the surveyors. And they're urging them here to give every facility to the operations of the Ordnance Survey as they moved across that particular parish. And the reality, of course, here is that the reaction to the engineers was very mixed, and understandably so. As Hewitt says, dressed in military uniform, the men were unmistakable emblems of British occupation. Now, we have very little evidence to show what they would have actually been dressed like. This is an illustration that you can see here on screen. It's more likely actually that, yes, they were in uniform, but it would have been like a dark navy. It wouldn't have been as stark as this in the landscape. We do know, though, at one point it was requested that they didn't carry any arms, and arms are quite clearly, depicted in this image as well. And this meeting of military employees with the resident civilians, of course, was popularised by the fictional account by Brian Friel in Translations, of course. And I think this particular quote from Translations really sort of fits with the letter or the correspondence that I'd just shown you previously. Well, I'll read it here. It says, every time they'd stick one of these poles in the ground and move across the bog, I'd creep up and shift it 20 or 30 paces to the side. Then they'd come back and they'd stare at it and they'd look at their calculations and they'd stare at it again and scratch their heads. And cripes, do you know what they ended up doing? They took the bloody machine apart, meaning the theodolite, So it was very complex. There was a lot that was happening in relation to, I suppose, the relations between the Ordnance Survey and the people on the ground. Now, by 1842, then, all parts of the island had been visited by the boundary team and the surveyors. And in the following years, then, the maps were drawn up in Dublin and printed and bound for sale. In fact, if we look at the detail on the maps themselves, it wasn't until actually 1851 that they were all signed off, finally. County Clare specifically was surveyed between 1839 and 1842. And you can see on this overview map on screen here, it indicates the almost 2,000 map sheets across the entire country. So we had a map sheet for lots of different areas across the whole space of the country. Now, I just want to, that's just a little bit of sort of background and context to sort of set the scene, but I want to move on to mention the role of the project that I'm involved with at the moment, OS 200. It's co-led by staff at the University of Limerick and at Queen's in Belfast, and of course various archives and other partners across the island, including the Royal Irish Academy, the Public Records Office, Northern Ireland, National Library Ireland, etc. And you can see the full list of those across the bottom. And importantly, it's something that's been co-funded by the Irish Research Council or Research Ireland and the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And it was a very specific fund that was about collaboration between Ireland and the UK. So for us, being north and south here, it truly is an all-Ireland project in that respect. It fitted us perfectly. And I think it's fair to say that one of the things that makes the project so special are the staff. So we are geographers, we are archaeologists, we are historians, linguists, computer scientists, and we've all been working through the last few years of the project and taking on each of our expertise, each of our skill sets, each of our knowledge and advice, as well as that of the librarians and the archivists who have been involved as well. And the system that we've built out of this that I'll show you towards the end of today, it really rests on that. So it's all about collaboration in that respect. And the project has been bookended by, first of all, the 100-year anniversary of partition. So that's when the OS became 3 agencies. And then on the other end with the bicentenary of the Ordnance Survey, which was last year, 2024, hence the project name OS 200. And really the aim of the project has been to draw together, to connect for the first time since their creation, several of the source materials that came out of that first survey, and to make them available to people freely through an online resource. Importantly too for us as academics on the project as well, we're looking at new ways that we can explore early sources too. So we're employing different types of digital technologies. Depending on who we are on the project, we're interested in different aspects, but looking at the life and the work of the people who were actually employed in the survey, but also the pre-famine populations of the island as well. And in addition to that, looking at the cultural, the natural, the built environment, landscape change over those 200 years. And importantly too, given this was led by British military, engaging with those more complex and challenging histories of the survey and the legacies that leaves with us today as well. So in the creation of the online resource then, and in the related research, we've been working primarily with 4 of the main source materials. I'm not going to talk about all of these today, but I'm going to lift out some snippets here and there. The first of those, of course, are the maps, which we're all very familiar with. And we have a full set of the printed volumes available to the project through Queen's in Belfast. Plus, we have the digital versions supplied to us through the National Mapping Agreement and Tulsh Éireann. Secondly, we have the Ordnance Survey letters. So these are correspondence between Ordnance Survey staff. We have these in original manuscript form from the Royal Irish Academy, also the 1920s O'Flanagan translations, or sorry, transcriptions of those as well, also at the Academy. Thirdly, we have the Ordnance Survey name books as well. So these are the detailed records of place names and their variations across the island, those coming from National Library Ireland. We had a really nice mutually beneficial agreement with NLI in that respect, where they were imaging it and then we were actually making a database out of it and then passing that information between us as well, which was great. The name books themselves was undoubtedly, or is undoubtedly, the most complex of all of the source materials. And so because of the limited time of the project, with only the 3 years, and also the funds as well, what we did with this was choose 5 cross-border counties to work on in terms of the name books as a beginning. So what we've done through the project then is we've built a methodology, and so we hope to then extend that to the name books across the island with a fund, in the near future, hopefully a follow-on project of some kind. And then lastly, we have the Ordnance Survey Memoirs, which was a scheme, of course, that covered only the northern counties of the island, and includes written descriptions of people in place, sketches and drawings and different things there as well. Now, of course, we've always had all of these sources, but we haven't been able to get access to them all in one place, and they've been in different states as well. So they're disparate, or have been disparate in that respect. And so really that's the foundation of the project here, to draw all of these together into a sort of a searchable resource format for everybody, and through our partners, Digital Repository Ireland as well. Now, the geographies of the source materials complicate matters a little bit. We do, of course, have the first edition maps for the whole island. You can see them here in green. But of course, the memoirs, as I mentioned, they only cover the northern half, a little bit more than Ulster, but let's say Ulster for now, certainly in terms of the detail. The letters we have for all counties except 3. And as I said, in this first run of the project, we're just using 5 of the county name books to build that methodology. And as I said, this is largely because they're the most complex of all of the sources. They really need a bespoke project on their own, in other words. And importantly, it is actually the geographies then that underlie the online resource that I'm going to introduce you to towards the end today. So we were thinking about, when we were developing the database, how can we connect all of these sources? And it was the geography that stood out to us the most, because it's the geography that is mentioned in all of these. So connecting those source materials through county, barony, parish and townland. So for instance, if you wanted to search for Kilrush parish through the online system, it would then produce all of the source materials that relate to that particular place. And that's the idea behind it, that sort of simplicity that's so important. Now on Clare then specifically, and also a little bit on Kilrush as well, I'm going to concentrate in a little bit more detail then and speak a little bit about each of these sources and the sorts of information I've been able to derive by using the online system. The maps themselves, of course, surveyed between 38 and 42. As I said, we had them in manuscript and digital format, and County Clare itself is about 90 sheets or so in total. The letters that were sent to and from the county, mostly from the county, were written between October 1839 and November of the same year. And they are vast for County Clare, I have to say. There are 3 volumes of them. And again, of course, we're working with the original manuscript scans here, but also the O'Flanagan transcripts as well. Now, the name books, of course, do exist for Clare, but are outside of the scope of OS 200, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about those. I'm sure you've heard them mentioned in many other talks by other people at different times as well. And of course, the memoirs don't exist for County Clare, but I am going to just talk a little bit about those just so you can get a feel for the content as well. So to the maps themselves then, the maps were printed and bound in these large volumes. You can see an image here from the Queen's Geography map library here on screen. A map sheet, of course, each page covering a different geographical area. And here the sheet for County Clare that covers Kilrush. Again, I'm sure you're all very familiar with it. But I think what many of us don't necessarily realise is that, yes, the map is a cartographic depiction, but the map sheets themselves in the printed volumes are much more than that. And they actually contain, along the base of each of them, a lot of marginalia. So there's a lot of additional information about that place. For instance, it gives us information on who surveyed it, who engraved it, who ornamented it, and when these events happened as well. So we're able to look at that over a period of time as well. And as part of the project, we had staff painstakingly record this marginalia and put it into the database. Again, this is available for you to look at, and connected it with those digital polygons that I showed you earlier. So the shapes, you know, in the computer of the counties and the baronies and the parishes and the townlands, etc. And that's allowed us to begin to start to analyse the survey in terms of the staffing that was involved and the networks of people as well. The image on the left here shows the makeup of these sheets across the island. As I mentioned, there are over 1,900, almost 2,000 of them. But what's quite interesting about this particular image is that it shows not just the geographies, but the temporal movement of the staff as well. So 1829 in the north with these sort of brighter colours, and we're moving down through the island, down into counties Kerry and Cork, into 1842. Also on the right, we're zooming in here to Kilrush, the Kilrush area, and from the digitised marginalia, we learned that actually that map sheet was surveyed in 1841. So just 1 year before the culmination of the survey. And we can also look in a little bit more detail at the people involved here in surveying Kilrush as well. Kilrush thankfully for me, it was quite an easy one because it is just one map sheet. Sometimes when I do these talks, there are several overlapping map sheets and I have to look at an awful lot of information in relation to that. You see it particularly around county borders, but we know that there were two main people involved in instructing this survey. Of course, there were many other men who would remain unnamed. Now, typically that can range anywhere between 2. I've seen as many as 8 people involved in some of the survey sheets. But what we do see is that it reduces in number as the survey progresses. So in other words, as they were perfecting their methods, they needed fewer staff in that respect. And these were the people involved. So we had Captain Stoddard and Lieutenant Beattie, both of the Royal Engineers. Other parts of Clare were also surveyed by Lieutenants Chater and Boteler as well. I'd be really interested to hear from anyone if you know anything about the lieutenants in particular, because I'm certainly not a military historian, but it would be interesting to know a little more about their biography, I suppose, as well. But the one person that we do know about is Captain Stoddard. Richard Hugh Stoddard was his name. And he was actually the lead surveyor for Clare. And in fact, he was in charge of the whole district in the west. He was an Englishman. He was from a Lincolnshire family and served as the commanding officer actually for the Royal Engineers in Limerick. And then 18 years on the Ordnance Survey of Ireland as well. And the map here shows where he was, first of all, lieutenant in the earlier years. So those are the sort of light blue coloured map sheets that you can see in the north. And then his temporal movement with those arrows across the island during the survey process. And then also when he was promoted to captain later on. So that's when you see the sort of orange or beigey colour start to appear there. Stoddard was also known as a man of innovation, and he often did a lot more than was requested of him, and this is possibly why he saw this promotion during this period of time. John Andrews certainly calls him enterprising, and if I take a quote here from Andrews in his book Paper Landscape, he mentions Stoddard and says, "He made a 5-foot plan of the River Moy in Ballina, Mayo, and unlike other district commanders, he produced large-scale plans of the towns in his district, whether the valuation office asked for them or not." So he was enterprising in that respect and had a good work ethic, I suppose you could say. But his son, Richard Hugh Stoddard, is interesting as well. He was actually born in Tyrone, County Tyrone, and he was also a surveyor and clearly was greatly influenced by his father's work ethic as well and expertise, I suppose. And in fact, at the end of his career, he served 3 years as the Director General of the GB Ordnance Survey. He was so well known and respected actually within the OS that in 1886, a book on the histories of the OS is actually dedicated to him. So you can see that sort of familial link happening there as well. And he certainly wasn't the only one connected with the Irish survey who reached such heights. We had, of course, Thomas Colby, who was leading the survey. There was Major General Henry James as well. He was involved in Ireland between 1834 and 1842. He was Director General for almost 20 years, in fact. So it was a training ground for the military surveyors, and many of them were rewarded for that in terms of promotion. And we can start to sort of delve a little bit deeper using, this marginalia and also the digital techniques that we can employ here as well. Here are 3 men, so Stoddard again, who I've already mentioned, but also Waters and Tucker. And particularly here, I think when you start to look at the geographies of this, you can see that during the early years of the survey, those lighter colours in the north, you can see that their time actually overlapped. So they were working together at some points. This again was when they were working on developing the methodologies that were employed then across the whole island. And then we see them each take on command of different parts of the island. So Tucker is over in the east, Stoddard travelling west, and waters dedicated to those more central counties. And we can even be more detailed than that as well. And I found this particularly interesting. How much work did these men actually do, in other words? And we can start to look at the percentage contribution. And the person who really jumps out again is Stoddard. So again, I think that really speaks to, again, his work ethic and his involvement in the survey. He was by far the greatest contributor to the mapping component of the survey. Now, if I just move on then to the letters, I picked out a few examples here for you this evening. The letters, of course, are correspondence. They are field notes. They are commentary between people like John O'Donovan and the superiors in Dublin. And I picked out a few examples here that relate to Clare and Kilrush specifically. Each of the volumes of letters begins with an index of places, which nowadays as geographers we would call a gazetteer, which is very helpful when you're trying to sort of figure out what's actually going to appear in one of the volumes as well. And then follow letters that include descriptions of people, place names, antiquities. For Clare, the letters actually began on the 10th of October in 1839 from Corofin. And most correspondence from Clare was by John O'Donovan and Eugene O'Curry. So O'Curry was, of course, a native of Clare, as I'm sure you'll all know, born near Kilkee in the late 18th century. And he was writing from Kilrush, actually, from the 2nd to the 6th of November. So we know he was actually lodging here at that time. There's also an A. Curry that is mentioned. I believe that is his brother Anthony. If anyone else knows anything more about that, that would be very interesting to learn. But A. Curry or A. O'Curry is mentioned a lot throughout the letters in various counties across the island as well. And one other man, a William Wakeman, who was charged actually with the majority of the sketches for County Clare. I'll show you an example of those shortly. And the letters here actually illuminate the sort of human aspect, I suppose, of the survey and the people involved, particularly from the point of view of these civilians who were involved as well. And poor Wakeman had very poor health. And we have O'Donovan writing to Dublin saying, well, where is he? Is he coming? Is he going to be able to keep up with us? Is he going to be able to find us? Things like that. And asking after his illness, although we don't know what the illness was. But what I found particularly interesting about him, so he was an English antiquary and artist, but when he was actually here in County Clare, he was only 17 years of age. And he had actually, from the age of 15, been a drawing pupil of George Petrie in Dublin. So he must have really stood out in terms of his education as a young man to have been tasked with this. I was reading a little bit more about him as well, and eventually he did actually become an art master in Pretoria Royal School in Enniskillen. So he would actually have been there at the same time as Oscar Wilde. And then I was going down one of those rabbit holes as we do, and actually many of his drawings actually appeared in William Wilde's publications as well. So there definitely was some sort of relationship there too. And you can see just the excerpt here from the letter. This is one letter to Dublin from O'Donovan explaining that they would head for Kilrush on the morning of Friday, the 1st of November, 1839. So that's when they were aiming to get there, and asking, please direct the post to Kilrush from that point forward. And there are 2 full pages actually dedicated to Kilrush here. These are the Flanagan transcriptions. I'm not going to go into any detail, but I'm happy to share these if people would like to see later. But for instance, we learn of ancient churches, burial grounds, holy wells, round towers. They write of families, saints, legends, as well as sketching antiquities as well. And there are some beautiful sketches of the county available as well. And we read lots of compliments on the history. I've spent a lot of time reading these letters, and they really are, they really do stand out in terms of the history and the details on the people and the place. O'Donovan describes it as truly romantic and full of interest. And he said that its history and ancient topography are better preserved than those of any county I've yet visited. because the ancient proprietors were never driven out, having always found shelter under the illustrious representatives of Brian Boru. So they had a lot to write about, and in fact, so much so that they had to request additional paper from Dublin. They were starting to run out of paper. That's why we have those three full volumes. They weren't, however, quite so complimentary about some of the lodgings. This was O'Donovan writing on the 25th of October to say, "It is with the greatest difficulty that we could get a single dirty room to write in, and I'm glad to find that our delay will not be long." And I'm sure those of you are familiar with O'Donovan's laconic humour definitely comes through in a lot of these letters. There were other fieldwork struggles highlighted by O'Donovan and by O'Curry. In mid-October, O'Donovan writes of his exploration of the wild rocks of Burren, where he was hurt by a mule, and his difficulty in crossing the Burren due to the limestone ditches, the walls as well. O'Curry tells us a little bit more about maybe what they were getting up to when they were out on their fieldwork as well. He says, "The hand that writes this has held intimate acquaintance with the spade during the last fortnight." So they weren't just going out and observing, in other words, they were getting stuck in. We don't know exactly what he was doing there because that's not detailed, but maybe a later example will give you a little bit more insight. And when they were in Ennis in mid-November, O'Donovan explains that they're in danger of getting into debt because it's such an expensive town. The weather is also a real highlight in the letters. O'Donovan and Curry speak of incessant rain in Corofin. And by the time they've reached Innistemen later in October, they can't even leave their lodgings because the rain is so wild. In fact, they record the severe flooding to the landscape, which is really making their continued travel and investigations additionally challenging. But I mean, I think to be fair, we're bearing in mind, we're talking about October and November here as well, maybe not the best time to be in the West. And we also have evidence of O'Curry actually writing to Dublin to ask someone to go to his home and search out an old Irish deed, as he calls it, among his papers that references certain lands in the neighbourhood of Kilrush. Now, I don't know what this refers to. I would like to look into this in a little bit more detail. Again, if anybody has any idea, it would be interesting to discuss that as well. And they also write regarding the not my words, now barbarously called Scattery Island, and the lack of history collected and collated on it. And they did spend quite a bit of time there gathering information as well. And there's some wonderful descriptions there of the coastline, of course, almost 200 years ago, focusing in on that, on the location, the rich number of forts in particular, because they're very interested in antiquities and the histories of the place. And they even include a particular tale of the discovery of a fort at Kilkee by a farmer. And it's quite an interesting story. One of his cows didn't come home one night, and he went up to find her, and he found her leg was stuck in the ground, and he got some of his friends out to dig the cow out, and they actually discovered passages underneath the ground, you know, and it's detailed in quite a bit of detail there by O'Curry. And then from 6 Mile Bridge, at the end of their time in County Clare and heading for Limerick, we read an interesting description from O'Donovan of the county, his health, and what he calls the Clare air. Now, that my accent with this is a bit challenging, but he says, "I'm knocked up today with a severe cold, which I caught at that ugly place, Killaloo. But I hope I shall be able to go on a wisp of a straw to Limerick tomorrow. You talk of Clare air in your last letter, but what do you think of wet turf, sleeping in bogs, damp beds, potatoes like turnips, half-baked bread, adulterated tea, no meat, broken panes of glass, and paying 2 and 6 per diem for an office to write in? All these things are not counterposed by Clare air, but our work in Clare is now clearly done, thank God, and it is too late to complain, but we have suffered more than I can now remember." So he wasn't all complimentary. And just days, actually, after having left and arriving in Limerick, we learned that it wasn't to his taste either. He didn't stay very long there, and he moved very quickly to Dublin because he couldn't get a single room in that city in which to sit quietly. But if you investigate the date here, you realise that it coincides with Father Matthew and the temperance movement. So Limerick was completely swamped in those, 3 or 4 days. With the Father Matthew's supporters. So they moved back to Dublin then, in other words, to write up all of the information that they've collected on Clare. And just to give you an idea of the sorts of drawings and sketches that are contained within these letters, again, these are all on the online system for you to have a look at if you wish. Here, the tower and the church of Dysart in County Clare, and a modern image of that as well. This is by the man Wakeman that I mentioned earlier, who then later was in teaching in Enniskillen and has that wild connection as well. Really, really detailed. And I think considering the descriptions I have made of the weather and things like that, it's even more extraordinary. So I don't know how quickly they had to do these sketches, between showers and things like that. But, you try to imagine sort of putting yourself into their shoes. And as I mentioned earlier too, there are copious what are map traces as well. So this was something that was very commonplace throughout the survey, where they had access in Dublin to original, much earlier maps, mainly 16th, some 17th century maps as well. And they traced them and they sent them out in the post to the field staff to work with. And this is one example of one of Ortelius's maps that has been traced in Dublin and sent out in the correspondence. And just very briefly then, sort of just to go through the memoirs. Again, I don't have anything obviously related to Clare here specifically, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of a feel for some of the information within those texts as well, which gives a really nice picture of the people of Ireland, particularly obviously the people of Ulster. But this was an additional scheme that was aimed really to supplement the maps on a parish by parish basis with what they called statistical information. It was things that couldn't be represented on the map, in other words. So the idea originally was we will publish the map sheets and we will publish this booklet alongside it with all of the supplementary information. And the ground staff were asked to observe information on landscape, topography, geology, antiquities, people, culture, communications, even suggestions for improvement as well. So lots and lots of information was collated. But I would say that it was non-compulsory. It was very much open to interpretation as well. So in some parishes, we have a wealth of information, in others, not so much. So it just really depends on the place and the person who was doing the recording as well. But equally, it's a fantastic textual and visual description because we have drawings and sketches as well of people in place in pre-famine Ireland. Sadly, it was cancelled largely due to cost. So they focused, first of all, in the northern parishes, one of Templemore in Derry, which was the only one that was actually ever published. The idea was it would take about 6 pages per parish. Templemore Derry actually took 350 pages. And it had a cost of nearly £2,000. So you can see why they said no more, so they drew a line onto that, unfortunately for us. But I mean, there is that real wealth of information for the northern counties, as I mentioned as well. And just to give you a bit of a feel for that, I mean, they even have meteorological data, the weather information there for 15 parishes. They collected information on temperature, barometric pressure, wind direction. And then there are a lot of qualitative descriptions of weather. So it was a wet day, it was rainy, it was stormy, it was sunny, those sorts of things as well. And we've been working on how we can start to analyse that information in a little bit more detail too. Here, for instance, is the temperature information. We've started to plot that out. It's interesting looking at this in relation to what we do know of the weather, which isn't very much because we don't have localised weather like this for Ireland in the same way. But for instance, we see the big wind of January 1839 really jumping out from the pressure and the temperature readings that they took. Of course, that also links with what was written about it as well. So this is James Boyle from Carrickfergus saying, "This storm will be long remembered in this country as it committed more devastation amongst trees and caused more injury to houses than any on record." And a lot of people were looking back just to our most recent January storm and saying something similar. John O'Donovan, and I don't have a clip of this, but he was in Wexford at the time, and his is a very interesting description of having the window blown out of his accommodation and things because of it. But also within the memoirs are other information related to migration, for instance, as well. So this is for Carnmoney parish. So between 1836 and 38, and this is a table of the people, the families, and details on them, their religion, their occupations, the townland that they were from, their townland of origin, and the ports that they went to, so where they left and went to. And we don't have this sort of information, this sort of detail in other records. We can also look at through these digital methodologies, the names of the people that were involved as well. But there are also some really nice genealogical snippets in there in terms of the text as well. And I really like this quote. This is again in relation to Carnmoney in County Antrim, and Boyle writes, "It is rather surprising that scarce a farmer can tell how even his father or grandfather came into possession of the farm in which he dwells," which I think tells a really interesting story of the people of Ulster as well, bearing in mind here we're thinking about Ulster Scots primarily too. And of course, there are actually descriptions and commentary on these people themselves, so we can learn a little bit about their habits and their character. So they're essentially Scottish, they're blunt and honest and respectable, they're too prone to whiskey drinking. They talk a little bit of the accent being peculiar, and among the old people, disagreeably strong and broad. I can make those jokes myself, I think. And even right down to appearance as well. So in stature, the men generally exceed the middle size and are pretty well made. The women are not generally good looking. Their complexion by no means feminine. So really getting quite personal in some respects there as well. And again, bearing in mind that many of the people who were recording the memoirs were not military either. We're talking about civilians too, who are actually living amongst the people as well. But I think there's a more serious angle to this as well that we also have to consider, and that is the bias that clearly comes through too. So we do see a lot of discussion over the Scottish and the Protestant settlers being deemed moral, and the native Irish less so. You see it particularly when their homes are described, for instance. So an Irish home might be described as less clean, the habits of the people less virtuous, inferior, generally uncivilized, in other words. Whereas when they talk about the Scottish or the English settlers, they're remarked on as being industrious, neat, a cause of improvement in the parish, etc. So there's a lot of very interesting detail in there that is reflective of the personal bias of the individuals probably as well, so you would need to know more about those people themselves who are actually writing the records to understand that in more depth. And then, as I mentioned, also the drawings and sketches within the memoirs too. Again, beautiful drawings and sketches. These are a few I've just selected out from different parts of the island here. I have to say some of the staff are a little more artistic than others, but they all count because they're all a lovely record of what was in many cases. But you can really see some of the detail, very, very artistic in different ways. And from these drawings, we've actually been starting to do a little bit of analysis because there's very little known about it. This is County Derry that you can see here on screen. And we've been looking at ways that we can actually start to learn more about the drawing process, for instance. So here, this is temporally helps us sort of fit together where they were drawing and when they were drawing, for instance. So if you see the area there in pink, those are the townlands where drawings were done in 1834. Or if you look at the dark green in the north, that was 1835, or that sort of light blue colour into 1836. So starting to get a bit of a feel for that movement across the county and the length of time it took the number of drawings as well that were involved. And in fact, we can go much further than that and look at the people and the place and the time together. And this is very complicated to do within this sort of cartographic representation. Time and space and how to visualize that is a very complicated one. But here we're just looking at some of the people involved as well. And there was one man in particular named Stokes, who was concentrating on antiquity and architecture in particular. He made actually over 500 sketches in total during his time with the OS. And that makes sense because also he traveled a lot with George Petrie. And he helped Petrie collect folk songs and information on antiquities as well. So when you read Petrie's work, Stokes is behind some of that too. And then just to finish up then today, I just wanted to show you the actual online resource itself. I'm not going to go online to show it, but I've just got a couple of screenshots to give you an idea of what we're working with here. But it's a pretty standard sort of search facility here where you can narrow down things by geography, as I said, so that's absolutely central to it. Thinking about what county you're interested in, barony, parish, right down to your townland, and then following through in the system either via the map interface or a list information or a list of particular objects within a collection. You can then open those up and explore them in a little bit more detail. There is also the option to look at temporally, so you can look at particular time periods, and also there are people's names in there as well. So if there was somebody who drew something, somebody who wrote something, etc., you can search under their names as well. And that QR code, I think maybe we can share it later with people even as well, but that's probably the easiest way to get onto the system and look at it yourself. But we would be very interested in feedback from that too, you know, if you've anything to add. But it's a really nice way just to get to grips with your own place, I suppose. And I know many of you are familiar, but maybe you will find something new in there, something fresh as well. And as we progress in the near future, hopefully we'll get the name books across for County Clare as well, which I think everyone would appreciate because they're one of the most rich source materials of all. Just to finish up today again, just to say that thank you for having me along, but also that there is more to come. So this is only the beginning here. We have the architecture in place, and then the idea is that as we move forward with different funding pots and different projects, we will add to that. So hopefully it will become richer as the years go by. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. That was absolutely fascinating. Kept us all spellbound. 30 of us on YouTube and about 50 of us here in the room. So we'll throw it open to questions from the floor, and I'll give this mic to Paul Gleeson. And please don't start speaking until you have the mic in your hands so those watching on YouTube can hear you.
Thanks, Paddy. Who's first for a question?
Excellent lecture talk. Whatever the best description for it was actually fierce informative. Could relate to an awful lot of the stuff. You know, big interest in that field and geography and maps especially. I love looking at maps. Even if I don't know whether or what countries.
Speak up because
sorry.
We can't hear you in the room. That only helps the people listening on YouTube.
Sorry. Okay.
It's not amplified.
Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. Sorry. No, I would say very good, excellent talk. Really enthralled by the information and so on. I very much interested in maps and in mapping, and really look forward to this lecture here tonight. Great information, and can relate to a lot of the places you talked about and some of the people as well, because one of the people mentioned there, Eugene O'Curry, he only was born a few miles away from where I live, in Dunagh, County Clare, and he was never really recognised for the work he did by the people in power in this country. And
his brother too.
Yes,
because there's
that's
an awful
right.
lot of work in there.
And I think his brother, I think himself and his brother, but I know Eugene had a hedge school, but I think his brother was a teacher as well, you know. And they have a connection with, ended up in County Tyrone. I think it was, what you call him? His name is gone now, but he went to school. There was a son of Eugene O'Curry's brother teaching in Tyrone in the 1920s.
Oh, okay.
So he was
Ben
very
Kiley,
much.
you're trying to think of, was
That-
taught by a Curry from Kilkee and
Was-
Oma.
Pardon?
Ben Kiley was taught by a Curry from Kilkee at school in Oma in Tyrone.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I think it was maybe him. So yeah, it's a lot of the information, the way it was done and so on, and the descriptions. You know, the John O'Donnell has great description. I think O'Curry as well. You know, the diaries of going through. You know, it rained and rained and rained, and you know, imagine now we go today. We'll be not. Put on the coat and everything else, you know, and we have all sorts of oilers and so on to keep the rain off. But imagine trying to get through the work in those conditions, you know, and also the amount of work, you know, the measurements and so on, that how accurate. I think it's practically, it's only out of 0.000. It's out very little in when they've done it in the Ordnance Survey. They've been around a few years ago and remeasured, and the measurements are already out. The scale is so small, it didn't matter really, you know. That it was excellent work, and and County Clare has been very much involved in the Ordnance Survey, especially with Eugene O'Curry. It's a very interesting project, very interesting work that has been done, you know, and maps and so on. You know, you could forever talk about it. But, sorry.
Okay, Paddy. Anybody next? Okay, Finbar. Okay, Finbar.
Oh, yeah. I have a map here that was produced for the sale of a landlord's estate in he died in 1850, and the estate was put for sale in 1852, and there was 19 townlands. And this is the map that was produced for it. Could you hop into that?
Thank you. Let's have a look at this. Can I show it on the screen as well? Just so people know what we're looking at. Kilmore Estate.
You finished?
Maybe we can have a wee chat about it after.
Yeah, okay. And they give a detailed account of all the tenants, the names and the rent they paid, and the maps of all their land. And the only one thing I was wondering about was the rent they paid. And some of them paid a penal rent, which was double the normal rent. I couldn't understand that. But
Yeah, the difference.
I'll be over to you in a second. Kilrush.
Several more questions here in the room.
I'd be very brief. I'm just curious, did you use the Irish language database when you were researching the name books, Lug Anamnica?
Yeah, oh yeah,
You did?
absolutely. And in fact, my colleague Angus Finnegan from UL was heavily involved. He used to work for Logan. So,
Okay.
yeah, no, absolutely.
I was just
And
curious.
they
about
were
that.
they and DCU partnered with us on the project. Yeah.
On the basis that there was an inch discrepancy on the baseline, by the time they got down to Cork and Kerry, would there have been, say, a foot, yard, whatever?
Well,
Error.
that's what happens, isn't it? Exactly.
Yeah.
And I don't know if there are any surveyors or ex-surveyors in the room here, but
Well, no, anytime I would have done engineering, and we would have been using the chains in the back of Earlsford Terrace at one stage and things, and they're not very accurate.
They're definitely
but the baseline is.
there are mistakes.
Who was next that wanted to ask a question? Did you want to ask
We definitely see issues, particularly around water bodies as well. and where there are borders or maybe some map sheet joins and things like that. That's primarily where we would see that. And it becomes even more complex now when they're being what you would call geo-referenced to show on something like GeoHive as well. And then some of you might have noticed that different map editions don't quite line up when they're on top of each other and things like that.
Michael McNamara has a question.
You mentioned Thomas Spring Rice. Well, there's a map here on Ardenir, which is near Fines, County Limerick, and it was the property of Stephen Dickinson, Esquire, and it was surveyed in February of 1833. So you might like to
have a look after, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
I don't know if we can. It's a show and tell tonight. I wonder, can we get this one onto the camera? It's a bit large to show people. But oh. Yep. Oh, yeah.
Dr. Porter, thank you very much for your presentation.
You're welcome.
Like all people around me, really enjoyed it. Earlier in your presentation, there was a reference made to the fact that the surveyors found the storylines here, the family histories, the local monuments, was much more thorough and going back much further in time because of the absence of population movements.
Yeah.
As was bearing in mind that Cromwell had been in action 2 centuries earlier, not that long before, but there hadn't been a movement of Clare people out of Clare up to that point. Do you think there's possibility in the future to develop that distinction in terms of what were they finding out here that was absent in other counties where there had been movement? Thank you.
Absolutely, yes. And again, those are the sorts of lines that we are following up. And yes, we are doing close reading, but we're also cheating a little bit using what we would call distant reading. And we're actually starting to harness computer technology to help us do that a little bit, because particularly with the letters, they're so vast. It would take you a career to read through and to understand them all. So we're trying to get help to jump to the bits that matter, and then do exactly what you suggest. So start to say, yeah, what was different, what sort of stood out. I think that was particularly interesting about Clare, that they could read that from the people and from the landscape, that it was that bit richer than some of the other counties that they'd been to at that point. I'm trying to think about the order where it does matter where they visit first there as well, and I'm just trying to recall exactly what order, what came after Clare, but they were certainly back in Dublin for a while first. But yeah, exactly that. And that in itself would be really, really interesting, wouldn't it? And very fruitful, I think. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, exactly that. And that.
For an absolutely excellent lecture. I'm sitting here going, I did a history PhD, maybe I should have done geography. But my question, Catherine, is who decided on the final spelling of townlands? How I know I'm sure it was controversial enough, perhaps, but
absolutely, and that actually is more of a question for my colleague Angus. Maybe you get him here some evening as well. But I don't have an image of the name books here to show you, but you'll know, maybe some of you, that it was a table and you had all of the different versions of the name, and then they decided on an anglicised version of that. O'Donovan, of course, played a massive role in that. But so did a lot of the informants as well, and they didn't always agree, again, just like the boundaries. And so there was a lot of to and fro in that respect. And equally, like I was mentioning to you earlier as well, there are even local groups now who are campaigning to have place names changed and to have that recognised too, so maybe changes afoot again in some places. So, yeah.
Michael, is it?
What about modern technology and so on? Probably, I don't know about Google, but every Tom, Dick and Harry now that names their house gets to put up as a name of a town. It ends up in a townland, as happened here in Clare, where Ballymackay is the name of a house, but it's where your man comes from in County Cork.
Yeah.
And when you go looking for, it overrules a townland called
I
Colas.
wasn't aware of that. That's interesting.
Oh yeah. Another one. I saw a few friends of mine who were involved in a traditional boat, and they're sailing from Quern, where I live, to well, I would call it Camogue Point, but they had down Magona. So Christ Almighty, I looked up and I suddenly saw it was up on Google Map, but I know how it happened because there's a I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. Just spelled MOWGNA. There's a guy living there now who comes from. That's a town in the North Clare. So there's an awful lot of and Google, you know, they put it up. It's impossible to put it right again, you know.
Yeah. Well, as long as it wasn't Mr. Trump.
Yeah. Well, good.
Once it's not the Gulf of Mexico. Once it's not the Gulf of Mexico. It's funny you should. It's funny Paddy should say that. There's is it outside Ballymacalig, isn't it? There's an area called Paradise, but it's Paradise is not actually a townland. It's just it was the name of the estate, and a lot of people just they assume that their townland is Paradise, but
it never was.
It never was. Yeah.
But then maybe that's what matters more. It's what the people feel about the place.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. Is there any one final question over here? Sorry.
Tony, wait for the microphone. Start again so those on YouTube can hear you.
Lovely. Do you find with the disappearance with urban sprawl, there's a lot of townlands disappearing?
Yeah, of course.
And who are the biggest abusers? I blame the post office, the postman, for accepting places to tell people that they're not living there. But they seem to, I think for about every town, 10 townlands, one takes over. Would you?
One that's more prominent. Yeah. I know.
But why do?
Absolutely true, but
And then you have developers who couldn't care less. They just want to give it a nice, rosy name, you know, which is it's a pity really that's allowed.
But sure, in Northern Ireland, they've named all the roads, haven't they? And they've given numbers, which has caused the death of a lot of townlands, hasn't it?
But we now have the townland on the road name plates as well, which is a step forward. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd just like to know, were they aware of the grand jury maps?
Yes, absolutely.
Did they
used them
interact?
very heavily, and they consulted them. They did.
Okay.
Them and the Down survey were the ones that were used the most, which is interesting given the inaccuracies of them, and also depending on which grand jury map you're talking about as well. But they did, and you see those mentioned throughout the letters and the name books as well. Okay.
Taylor and Skinner too, I presume, is that?
Pardon?
Taylor and Skinner's maps.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, I think has everybody asked a question? We have one final question here.
We have a couple on YouTube as well that I've covered.
As an entirely amateur genealogist, how accessible and how easy will it be for me to find out about my ancestors in West Clare through using your system?
I don't know, if I'm honest. I think you would be able possibly to find some information in the name books, but they're not yet part, of course, of this. There may be something in the letters if they were particularly renowned, but aside from that, probably not, because we don't have that memoir collection for Clare, and that's the difference there. So, even in the memoirs for the North, in some parishes, they even list all of the names of people buried in the graveyards as well, and those are yards that are maybe now gone, so, but unfortunately we just don't have that for Clare.
We have a couple of questions on YouTube. Barry Dolby says, is it possible to view the Ordnance Survey name books for counties like Waterford, Wicklow, etc.? The National Archives hold the originals, but only some of them are available on microfilm last time he looked.
Yeah, no, not at the moment. I'm aware of a couple of county libraries. I wouldn't like to say who are working towards doing that with their own counties at the moment, but it's going to come next. That's what we're looking at. So we'll be searching for a fund so that we can actually connect all of the name books across the island to this system as well. And I know I'm asked this at every talk I do because people are so keen to get them. But that in itself is a massive project. So we couldn't have possibly done it as part of this But we have that architecture in place now, so hopefully it will be a lot more straightforward. But it's an awful lot of work, and it's going to require, well, we were talking about staff and things like that, someone who is an Irish language expert and a database expert. So that will be interesting to find. There's a lot of different skill sets that are involved there, as well. So, but it is coming. It is on our list, absolutely. Yeah.
And I'm not sure, is this?
Of course.
Yeah, of course, there's no problem. It's been
Last question online, and this is a similar one from Jenny Bassett. Thanks for sharing your wonderful work. I went on the website recently. As you mentioned, the memoirs, letters, and sketches aren't online. Did they exist? If so, when can I see them?
Yeah, so the memoirs are there for you. Everything is already available there. It may be, depending on the place that you're looking for, they don't exist for that particular place, because bear in mind the memoirs have a limited extent. So we're only talking about Ulster, a little bit more than Ulster, but certainly nothing further south than that. Pardon? The Griffith, no. So they relied on that Ordnance Survey, and because Richard Griffith had been involved with the boundary team already.
I see in Kilrush now with different valuation, but the number of the houses, and when the census came along, they changed there was the other side of the street, right?
The numbers changed, yeah.
The numbers changed.
Yeah, I know.
And there's two houses with the same number of the street.
They're just trying to confuse it.
We all have air codes now. We don't need any of this information anymore.
Dr. Catherine, thanks for the lecture. In relation to the letters, what happened to the letters from Cork?
I don't know.
Okay.
No.
It's interesting, isn't it?
So everything was in Phoenix Park and then donated to the Academy, and they weren't there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. It's just interesting that they went missing from Cork. But anyway, thank you for your lecture tonight.
Okay, before we wrap up, I've been asked to mention the St. Senan's Day Walk 2025, a walk on Sunday, the 9th of March. That's next Sunday week, from the birthplace of St. Senan in Malacca, starting at 3 p.m. to Knockera Church, about a 3-mile walk. Refreshments served afterwards in Knockera Hall. Cars can be parked at Knockera Car Park, and people can carpool to Malacca. As you might know, it's an hour little country road. So talk to John Mulqueen, who's down there in the audience, if you want to know any more about that. I don't know, is there still a pilgrimage to Scattery Island on St. Senan's feast day on the 8th? But you can go on both if there is. We'll be back here on the 25th of March, 4 weeks from today, same date next month, when Michael Talty of Clare County Library Local Studies Centre will be giving a talk on caring for your family archives. And on the 29th of April, we have Mike Grimes talking about the last of the River Shannon reed cutters. I see Patsy Parrell down in the back row. That might be who he's going to be talking about. And I don't know, is Patsy selling his book, Swimming Upstream, The Life of a Salmon Fisherman and Reed Cutter? But Lisa, our chairperson down the back, is selling our Kilrush Memories of a Market Town and our Down Memory Lane calendar next year. And I'd like to remind everyone here, if you aren't a member of the society, it's only €20 for the year. It gets you to all our events, especially those of you who are lucky enough to be watching free on YouTube. You can go to our website and pay your €20 membership fee for the year via PayPal. Just let us know that that's what the €20 is for when you're paying. So thank you to everyone listening on YouTube. Thank you here. And thank you especially to Catherine, who I think deserves a huge round of applause for that.